Hello, I'm Gena, Korea, speaking from the United States, and I feel very honored to have been invited to be with you and to speak with you. Wish I were there in person, but we'll do our best from here. This is what I want to talk about today. Some people are better than other people. Some people are worthy of life, other people just are not. The ones who are unworthy, it would be better for everyone if they never came into life in the first place. These are the tenets of eugenics, a bogus science calling for the improvement of the human race through control of human breeding. Sir Francis Galton founded eugenics in England. He was the cousin of Charles Darwin, known for his theory of evolution, that includes the supposition that an individual's traits could be inherited by his progeny. Galton took this further. If physical traits could be inherited, so could character traits. One could breed out these undesirable traits, breed out the defectives. Those the Nazis would later call lebensunwürdiges Leben, life unworthy of life. For eugenicists, the solution to many social problems became clear. Just sterilize the problem people. Don't let the lebensunwürdiges Leben, the defectives, reproduce their kind. The defectives included what they called deaf mutes, madmen, alcoholics, idiots, drug addicts, licentious women, they didn't seem to be licentious men, venereal disease carriers, wastrels and hooligans, paupers, in other words, the poor. As one physician eugenicist wrote, we would sterilize these people for the same reason we would weed a garden. With knowledge of heredity, the eugenicists believed, race making was possible. They could spawn supermen. All they had to do was encourage the worthy to produce more children and discourage the unworthy from breeding at all. The discouragement included forced sterilization, segregation in camps where they would not be allowed to reproduce. And the Nazis took this further, kill the unworthy, the lebensunwürdiges Leben. A superior race would be created not only by sterilizing the unworthy, but by breeding superior people as animals are bred. Those are the ideas of the eugenics movement that was so abundantly manifested by the Nazis in Germany with their death camps, their ovens, their practice of half-starving people, and then working them until they died. Encouraging the worthy to produce more children, the Nazis created the Lebensborn Institution in an effort to create superior people, breeding so-called Aryans. Aryan women, often blue-eyed and blonde, were mated with Aryan men in the SS. There was no need for love in the Lebensborn Institution. This was breeding. We're familiar with the vast Nazi implementation of eugenic policies, but eugenics did not begin with the Nazis. In fact, eugenic sterilization programs in the United States were models for the Nazis. Isabel Wilkerson writes of this in her book, Caste. As those attending the 1921 International Eugenics Conference in New York City could have testified, eugenics was a widespread, very respected movement. Its proponents addressed clubs and church societies and youth groups. They wrote many books up until the mid-1920s. As eugenicist Dr. Thurman Rice wrote in 1929, to advocate the teaching of birth control to everyone is dangerous. Birth control is for the unworthy families. Good families must not use it. Babies, better babies, and more better babies, he wrote in his book, Racial Hygiene, are by all odds the most important need of the times. Eugenic ideas became embodied in law. The first forced sterilization bill was passed in Indiana in the United States in 1908. By 1935, 27 states had enacted sterilization laws applicable to at least 34 categories of people. Courts ordered nearly 64,000 people sterilized between 1907 and 19... The United States, 10 other countries followed America's example in passing sterilization laws. As one American eugenicist noted approvingly in 1935, Germany has, during the last year, planned for sterilization on a colossal scale, unquote. And of course, Adolf Hitler was ruling Germany then. Those who judged a person's worthiness to reproduce often used pseudoscientific jargon. Amid talk of defective germplasm, recessive traits, and Mendelian ratios, the fear of immigrants and blacks and the disdain for lower economic classes are clear in the speeches and books of eugenicists. The immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, Dr. Thurman Rice declared, do not mix well with, quote, our stock, unquote. He added, if they do cross with us, their dominant traits submerge our native recessive traits. They are often radicals and anarchists causing no end of trouble. They have very low standards of living. They disturb the labor problems of the day. They are tremendously prolific. In 1934, eugenicist Guy Irving Birch seconded Rice. Quote, I think there is good reason to be optimistic about the future of the Native American stock if birth control is made available to the millions of aliens in our cities and the millions of colored people in this country. Besides birth control and sterilization, eugenicists also suggested the imprisonment of the, quote, unfit, unquote. In his 1911 book, The Methods of Race Regeneration, one physician defined this segregation method as, quote, the permanent care under humane medical supervision and primarily in their own interests of the naturally defective, unquote. Margaret Sanger, a founder of the birth control movement in the U.S., became a eugenics advocate. In 1925, on behalf of the 6th International Birth Control Conference, Sanger urged President Calvin Coolidge to appoint a commission to study the need for sterilization of the unfit. 1925, she was saying that, and think of what was going on in Germany at that time. Asked by students of Yale College in 1934 if there weren't a danger that the more intelligent classes would practice birth control, while the lower classes would not, and that society would thus degenerate, Sanger replied that that was exactly what the birth control movement aimed to prevent, quote, by more birth control among the illiterate and uneducated classes, unquote. 1934, again, think of what was going on in Nazi Germany at that time. The new reproductive technologies provide many more tools for widespread eugenics. Now, not so many decades later, many more tools than sterilization and segregation are available to implement a eugenic program. These are the new reproductive technologies. The eugenic tools are ever and quickly expanding, but for now they include in vitro fertilization. This entails injecting women with fairly brutal hormones, this is called superovulation, so that her ovaries produce not the usual one egg in a cycle, but many eggs. Those eggs can then be captured, they actually use the word captured, from the women's ovaries. Some of those the eggs can then be externally fertilized in the lab with the sperm of the father. They can then be implanted in the body of another woman, a so-called surrogate mother. First, there was IVF using the woman's own egg. Now IVF uses donor eggs, egg freezing, donor sperm, and donor embryos. Another technique is embryo evaluation. Embryos flushed out and examined, and if found unworthy, discarded. Embryo evaluation, technologists argue, could become a part of prenatal care. Now, in this later phase of the eugenic movement, it's not babies who are evaluated for their fitness, but life at an earlier stage, embryos. Sex predetermination, that would involve implanting embryos only of the desired sex. Surrogacy, this is the creation of a breeder class of women. We saw this earlier in the Lebensborn institution in Nazi Germany, where women deemed to be of good stock were bred with SS officers to create supposedly superior human beings. The modern surrogacy business, it is a business, also creates a breeder class. Surrogacy could be used with the embryo flushing technique, with artificial insemination, with in vitro fertilization, and with sex predetermination. Prenatal diagnosis can now be part of prenatal care. In some surrogacy contracts, women are required to undergo amniocentesis, and if the fetuses are found to be unworthy of life, to abort them. This is not the mother's decision, but the decision of the buyer. Another technique is in vitro gametogenesis, the production of eggs outside the body and from non-reproductive cells, like from blood cells. In 2016, 2 Japanese reproductive scientists announced that they had taken skin cells from a mouse's tail, reprogrammed them into stem cells, and turned those stem cells into egg cells. They fertilized the egg cells and transferred them into the uteruses of female mice, who subsequently gave birth to 10 pups. A few years later, scientists at the Church Laboratory at Harvard Medical School grew an ovaroid, which is an assembly of cells designed to mimic the structure and function of a crucial part of the human ovary, the follicle. Follicles are the pockets within the ovary that support and nourish eggs as they prepare to be released for fertilization. Scientists at the Church Lab and elsewhere have been creating biochemical and computer tools to build a follicle piece by piece out of multiple different kinds of cells. Quote, the ovaroid was a combination of all these cells in one organized structure, as one scientist said. Unveiled earlier this year, the ovaroid doesn't yet do the whole job of growing an egg, but it's a huge step towards that. The company Gamito is now working to advance its first product candidate, Fertillo, oh my God, these names, which is able to mature eggs outside the body. With the manufacture of eggs outside the woman's body, many new configurations become possible in which women are no longer necessary. The modern-day eugenic program is evident in an ethics report on the new reproductive technologies produced by the American Fertility Society early on in the development of the technologies, 1986. The American Fertility Society, or AFS, a professional association of some 10,000 U.S. physicians and scientists who work in reproductive biology, advanced the argument that it may be our human right to produce what was then still called test tube babies and to hire women as breeders. But not everyone has these human rights, the AFS declared. Some people being better than others, some people being worthy, others unworthy. Not everyone has that right. Among those who may have a duty not to reproduce in any way are people who live in so-called overpopulated nations. Women who are likely to be disobedient to the orders of their obstetricians, to the orders their obstetricians give them regarding prenatal care. People who do not have the money or the will to clothe, shelter, and educate their children in accordance with the proper, though unspecified, standards. In the 1920s and 30s, eugenicists might have called these people paupers. And women with defective genes who would burden society with disabled children. Some people may have a moral duty not to reproduce, the technodocs wrote in this report. The grounds which may abrogate the right to bring children into the world, they wrote, are 1, transmission of disease to children. Couples whose members both carry a serious genetic defect, quote, have a moral obligation to refrain from producing children who have a high risk of being afflicted with the defect, unquote. Elsewhere in the report, this is described as, quote, the situation in which a couple knowingly and avoidably conceives and brings to term a severely handicapped child, then passes to others the costs and burdens of rearing that child, unquote. The report contends that this ethical limit to reproductive freedom also applies to the breeder women they called surrogate mothers. It states, quote, prospective gamete donors or surrogates have a moral obligation to disclose familial genetic problems and to cooperate in appropriate screening programs. At the 7th International Congress on Genetics, held in September 1986 in Berlin, participants reportedly expanded the definition of genetic diseases. This gives us some idea of the flexible nature of the term serious genetic defect. Among the new genetic defects, genetic diseases which are to be detected and for which carriers should be counseled are coronary heart disease, alcoholism, schizophrenia and other mental disorders, and sensitivity to certain kinds of pollution. Think back to the list of those earlier eugenicists, the people they would have sterilized, madmen, alcoholics, etc. Number 2, unwillingness to provide proper prenatal care. This ethical position would give physicians still greater control over the lives of women, since they claim the right to define proper prenatal care. In the recent past in the United States, proper prenatal care included x-rays of pregnant women and severe limits on weight gain and the use of diuretic drugs and the cancer-causing synthetic hormone diethylstilbestrol. All of these have subsequently been found to be damaging and they have been discontinued. But this poor historical performance has not weakened the obstetrician's claim to be an expert on proper prenatal care. In the future, it may be proper prenatal care for physicians to flush the embryo out of pregnant women, evaluate it, and discard so-called inferior embryos and those of the undesired sex. They would reinsert approved embryos, worthy embryos, into the woman's uterus. Women unwilling to submit to this and whatever else physicians say is proper prenatal care could be informed that they have a moral duty not to reproduce. Number 3, inability to rear children. The report states, quote, it can be argued that a person who is not in a position to take on the responsibilities of providing food, clothing, shelter, education, and health care for a child ought not, from an ethical standpoint, bear or beget a child, unquote. That would include large proportions of the populations of whole continents. In the United States, where the gulf between the billionaire class and the poverty-stricken is growing larger every year, where the unequal distribution of wealth creates more and more paupers, many of the poor would be deemed to have a moral obligation not to reproduce. Number 4, overpopulation. The AFS report states, quote, it can be argued that when the population of a region or nation already places a serious strain on available resources, that fact of life may place a constraint on the liberty right to reproduce. One thinks, for example, of several African countries that are experiencing severe food shortages. However, this possible ground for limiting the moral right to reproduce does not seem to apply in the context of the United States at present, unquote, not surprising. Since the principle of selection and eradication permeates the ethics reports by the technodocs, it is not surprising that yet another section of the report deals with who ought not to reproduce, this time as egg or sperm donors. In the minimal genetic screen for gamete donors in the appendix of the report, the list of disqualifying medical conditions is so long, the reproductive scientists ultimately give up any attempt to name them all because it is impractical. I would have been rejected as a fit reproducer because as a child I had a disorder which caused me to be short of breath after riding a bicycle. Asthma was unpleasant. Once when I was 8, it scared me badly. Reason enough, I suppose, never to have been born. Life unworthy of life, lebensunwürdige Leben, count me in. I fit in that category. The eugenics movement is not history. It is now taking a new form. It poses an extreme danger to the human race and extreme danger to women. Thank you.